Thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar on using custom fonts with a Horner controller. The presentation is about 17 or so minutes long, and if you have any questions, we'll get them at the end. You can just use your panel that'll be on your screen. We'll get started.
Welcome to today's tutorial. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about fonts and how they work in the Horner OCS. We'll talk about font tools that are available in Seascape, including the font editor, the font manager, and the font creation wizard. We'll also have other tips and tricks for working with fonts, and we'll also show how to add fonts to the XL15 Plus, which is different from the other OCS models. We'll have demonstrations throughout, and as always we'll finish with a Q&A session. When would you use a custom font? Here are a couple of cases. You may need a font of a different size or a different shape than the built-in fonts. For example, you may need a tall or narrow font, or maybe you need a font with a different character set than what the built-in fonts feature. For example, you could use a Unicode font, which in Seascape can support over 65,000 characters from a broad range of languages. ASCII, on the other hand, only supports 128 characters. There is a trade-off here though, as Unicode fonts are huge in terms of memory usage, so you have to be careful with Unicode fonts. Whenever you have characters like Cyrillic type characters, or kanji for example, or other Asian languages, Unicode is going to be required. Horner OCS controllers offer a variety of font sizes with their built-in fonts. We also provide in Seascape additional tools that allow added fonts to be imported. These imported fonts have to end up in the right format. For all OCS models except the XL15 Plus, the font format used is .fnt. In the case of the XL15 Plus, you can take TrueType fonts and directly use those. Now let's talk about the font tools that are available in Seascape. First, you have the font manager. This is used for the addition of custom fonts, deleting custom fonts, or to replace a custom font that you may have been using previously. Then you have the font creation wizard. This is a tool that allows you to import a font and add it to your project in a semi-automatic process. Here, the wizard walks you through the entire process. Then you have the font editor, which you can use to manually import a font. You can also use this to create a font from scratch for use in the OCS. We won't spend as much time on this, but let's look at it quickly. So first, let's look at the font editor. The font editor is a tool that can be used if you want to draw a font from scratch. You can use this to edit fonts on a pixel by pixel basis. The font editor itself can support fonts up to 64 pixels high, including the space above and below the character. Though we do have the font editor, the font creation wizard is what most people use, because again, it walks you through the entire process. It can also support larger fonts than the font editor, as it can handle fonts up to 200 pixels high. It also provides control over which parts of the character set are imported. For instance, when importing Unicode fonts, you could have hundreds of thousands of characters. Obviously, you don't want to import all of those characters in if you're only going to use the normal characters that are part of the ASCII character set. You just want to import the ASCII part of that Unicode font. The font creation wizard gives you the ability to select just the part of the font that you want, and once you've made those selections, it can automatically add the font you've just imported into your current Seascape project. Now let's look at the Seascape Font Manager. This will show you at a glance which custom fonts are included in your current project, and it will also show you their size in bytes. Why is the size important? Well, there's a limited amount of memory available in OCS models for custom fonts. In that chart on the right, you can see that varies anywhere from 256 kilobytes in the case of the micro OCS, up to 4 megabytes for the X5, the XL4, on the way up through the EXL10. In the case of the XL15 Plus, it can support up to 50 megabytes. In addition to loading up files for use in your current project, the font manager also allows you to remove fonts from your current project. One thing that's important to mention is that after you've finished creating your project using your custom fonts, you don't necessarily have to keep track of your FNT files, because those fonts that you used in your project will be stored within the CSV file. If you want to use the custom font on a future project, however, you're going to want to keep track of that FNT file. Now let's begin our demo, where we'll be showing how to add a custom font to your project. For this demo, I'm going to be working with an XL4. Let's take a quick look at that XL4 I'm using. Here I have an RPM value for an engine along with an engine status. As you can see, I'm using small fonts here, which are fine if we're standing right in front of the screen. If what we are looking for are large fonts that can be viewed from a distance, then we'd want to potentially use custom fonts. Let's go ahead and do that. I'll open Seascape. Anytime we're working with custom fonts, we're going to be working in the graphics editor. So I'll open that. As you can see here, I just have text fields using the standard fonts. In this case, the largest font that's available in an XL4 built-in is a 20 pixel font. At the bottom we have an ASCII field. In the middle we have an integer data field for RPM. Finally, we have a plain text field for a title. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to come up with a larger font for our RPM value and our engine status. Let's start out in Tools, then Font Manager, and this will show us what custom fonts we're using in the project currently. As you can see, there aren't any. Next, let's go to the Font Creation Wizard because I don't have the large number font that I want to create ready yet. The first step in the Font Creation Wizard is it asks me, do I want to import an ASCII font? Then it asks, do I want to import a complete font, which includes all the Unicode characters? This would take up a huge amount of memory, so I won't select that one. We also have a custom font, which in other words is some subset of the full Unicode, but more than the base ASCII characters. I'll select the custom font. Now I'll hit next. Now I have to decide what font that I want to import into Seascape. Any font that's loaded on your computer will be available on this list. Here I have one I installed on my computer before, called Crash Number in Gothic, which has large numerals, so I'll select that. Font wise, I can select all the way up to 200 pixels high. The problem with the 200 pixel font is a lot of those pixels are taken up under the baseline, so I'm not going to be able to fit 200 pixels and position the numbers where I want them if I have that big area under the baseline. With numbers, however, there's nothing under the baseline. I'm going to go with a 150 pixel font. I'll find 150 on the list and select that. In terms of characters that I want to bring in, this is the starting and ending section of the character set. If I take a look at this lookup table, it shows me all the different sections starting from the first section here, which is C0 controls and basic Latin, all the way down through 100 different sections of characters in the font. In my case, I'm just interested in that first section that has the numbers and letters in it. I'll set the start and the end to the first section. Next, I need to type in the name of the font that I'm going to call this. Remember, we're taking a font from our computer and we're creating an FMT file which needs to go in the Cscape fonts directory. So I'll hit browse here and I'll go into the Cscape fonts folder. Then I'll name this Crash Num 150. Now I'll hit save. Next, I want to decide if I want to add this generated font that I'm getting ready to create to my current project. I have decided I will do that, so I'll leave that checked. The last step in this dialog is to hit create font. Now that will create all the characters and will create the new FMT file. It imported 95 characters, so not all 128 were used by this font. Now I'll hit finish. Now I should be ready to use that font. First I'll verify that it came in and I'll see what size it is. So I'll go back to the font manager and here is the font we've just imported. Here is the size, which is 242,000 bytes or 242 kilobytes. So that will fit in any OCS, even the micro OCS, if it's the only font. I'm currently programming an XL4, which has 4 megabytes available. I'll hit OK here. Now let's replace this standard font with the font we just imported. I'll go to the pull down list and I'll select the font I just imported. Let's see what happens when we hit OK. As you can see, we now have bigger characters. You'll notice that the tops of these characters are being shown outside of the boundary box for this data object. This means that the top of the numbers won't be shown, so we need to size this so that the numbers completely fit within the boundary of that object. Now you can see that they fit. Now we have characters being displayed the way we want. Now we also want to come up with bigger, taller and skinnier characters for our engine status as well. I'll double click on this ASCII data field. I don't want to use that big number font for this. So let's import another font. This time let's import a font that I previously created. Here I can just go straight to the font manager. I'll hit add a font and I can find the font here if it's one of the ones I've previously created. Here it is under agency FB60. It's added to the list and it's about 227 kilobytes. I'll hit OK. Now when I go in here and double click, I can see that I have another font added to the list. I'll select OK and then see how that one looks. Now you'll see that it's taller and skinnier. You'll see that this particular font has quite a bit of area allocated below the baseline for the tails of characters like on a lowercase y or a lowercase g. So I don't have the flexibility of moving it any further down on the screen. So that's the font for our engine status. Now let's see what this looks like on the XL4 itself. The first time you do a program download after you've added fonts into your project, the download takes quite a while because the fonts have to be downloaded to the controller. You can use your memory card and do an export to removable media on that download and then it'll go much quicker. So let's go ahead and do that now instead of doing a download, which would also work fine. It will just take longer for this demo. I'll hit File and then Export to Removable Media. I have a micro SD memory card and I'm going to overwrite the program that's already on there. I'm also going to verify that the version of the file that it's creating is compatible with the version of firmware I'm using. So on this XL4, it's using firmware version 15.52. So I have to pick a version that's less than that for the PGM file. 15.49 is less than 15.52. I can go ahead and create that. I'll put .pgm after that and hit save. Now that program has been successfully exported. Now I'll take out the memory card and put that in the OCS. Now let's look at our XL4 screen. It's still running our old program, so let's go to the system menu and look at the file that's on removable media. Then I will hit enter for that file and it'll be loaded from the memory card onto the screen. You can see how quickly that file loaded from the memory card. Now we have big readable characters for the RPM numeric value and for the ASCII text field engine status. Now I'll show another font that I can use in the micro OCS. Again, this font I just showed will work fine in a micro OCS as well, as it's also below 256 kilobytes. I'll start from scratch with a new Seascape file for this demonstration. It doesn't matter what logic language I'm selecting here, they're all the same when it comes to font support. I'll go to the hardware configuration. Instead of configuring this file for an XL4, I'll select Micro Series, and let's go ahead and select a Micro Series X7. It's telling me I only support 250 screens. That's not a problem. I'll select OK. Now I'll head straight to the graphics editor. I'll put a data field on the screen. I'll make a title and pretend it's a numeric data field just to show the font. I'll pick the biggest font that's available here, which is only 20 pixels, and you can see that's relatively small. So I'm going to go back to my tools, then Font Manager. I'll hit Add, and then the font I want is called DSEG160, and I'll select that. Now I'll go back here and take a look at what the font looks like. Again, I'll check to see if the font size falls within the memory limit for the micro OCS, which in this case is 256 kilobytes. Then in my data field I will select that font. I hit OK, and you can see we now have big numbers that we could easily see from a distance. So that's an example of another large font. Now let's talk about a few tips and tricks. Firstly, remember, only import Unicode fonts if you're going to use them, because they take up a lot of space. Import only the character subset you need again to save space. You can find many fonts on the web if you just search for TrueType fonts. Many of these are free, and many of them that aren't free are very economical, and make sure you don't violate anybody's copyright. The fonts that I imported were fonts that were free to use. You should always check your font memory usage to make sure the font will fit. Also remember that there's a bit of space taken up by fonts under the baseline in some cases, so be aware of that. And like I did in my demo, if you've got a large numeric data field, consider eliminating the legend and the border and getting rid of the background color. That will give you the most flexibility to put the data field where you want it. Lastly, here are the authors of the two fonts I used in the first demonstration. Now let's look at how fonts are handled in the XL15 Plus, because it's slightly different. the XL15 Plus can directly handle TrueType fonts. Remember, with the XL4 and the Micro OCS as we were demonstrating, we were using TrueType fonts, but we were using tools in Seascape to convert those TrueType fonts into an FNT file format that the OCS could handle. The XL15 Plus, however, can handle TrueType fonts directly. So what's the process for using those fonts? For this, you need to go into the area of Windows where your TrueType fonts are already installed. That can be found in the control panel under Appearance and Personalization, and then the Fonts folder. There you'll find TTF files, which are TrueType font files. Then you can copy the TTF files that you want to use in your project into the Fonts folder under Seascape. Once you do that, you can go back into Seascape, and then using the font tools that are available for the XL15 Plus, you can then select the fonts that you want to use in your project. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to do that in Seascape. First, I'll show where in Windows those TrueType fonts are located. Here is my control panel, Appearance and Personalization, and then Fonts. Now you can see a large amount of font files. I just copied one in this case called Stencil Regular. I copied that into my Seascape Fonts folder. Now I'll go into Seascape and then the graphics editor. Now when I go to Tools, I see that the only font tool I have available with the XL15 Plus is Select Fonts. When you do that, now all the TTF files that are sitting in the Fonts folder are available to be selected for this project. I only put one in there, so that's the only one available. Now you can see it's showing me how much I've used of my 50 megabytes that's available for the XL15 Plus, and it's just a fraction. I'll select OK, and now when I put something on the screen, a data field or a text label, whatever the case may be, and I go to select our font, Stencil shows up. For these imported TrueType fonts, you can choose the size independently. You don't have to choose strictly a single size. So I could select a 28 point size here for this data field. I could then take this data field and copy and paste another data field and set a different font size. So for example, I'll set a 48 point size for this data field. If you want a font size that's bigger than the maximum in the drop down menu, which is 72, you can simply manually type in that font size. So with the XL15 Plus, when you import a font, you have a range of different sizes to choose from, whereas with the other OCS models, every time you import a font, you're importing it at a specific size. Thank you for joining us for today's tutorial, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions in. If I slightly exceed the font limits, is there anything I can do? Depending if you're using a complete font and you're not needing all the characters, you could switch to making a custom font for just the subsets you need. Or alternatively, in download options, you can compress the font. So compressing it will reduce it, but you gotta keep in mind that you will not be able to upload the program if you use the compress fonts function. Can we have above 72 font on XL Plus? I think that came in just before it was said in the presentation, but yes, you can manually type it in over the 72 that is shown in the options on the TrueType fonts for the XL Plus. That looks to be the questions I am seeing so far. So we will follow on as always and take you back to my screen. So next week, our webinar is on using WebMI with a large production monitor. And then we're into part 4 of our IAC support, so UDFBs. And then we'll have a double header of recipe management in the following weeks. The registration links are there as always. If you have any interest in these, do register now, please. And if there's anything we haven't covered, feel free to drop me a mail at the tech support email and we'll try to cover the topic that you wish that we haven't yet done. And as always, if you want to run back on any of them, they're all there, the past ones. I'll have one quick check of the questions panel. That appears to be it for today. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and we hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.